Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the Venezuelan referendum and Hugo Chavez's ongoing war with the Western media. The writer's strike with the online picket line. What? Iran has no nuclear weapons program? What will the U.S. media talk about now? And the return of the sacked shock jock to American airwaves. Welcome back. Venezuela was in the world's headlines this past week over the referendum vote called for and lost by President Hugo Chavez. The coverage preceding the vote and the analysis that followed threw into sharp relief the bitter relationship between the outspoken president and the Western news media that shapes perceptions of him. There were 69 amendments on the ballot, but the media outside Venezuela seemed fixated on just one of them, the one that would have abolished term limits for the presidency. Our starting point this week is Hugo Chavez getting a fair shake from the Western news media. And if not, why not? Media myth number one on President Hugo Chavez, that he is a dictator, or at least a dictator in the making.
Fred, what happens to that country if these constitutional changes are approved?
Well, he becomes a dictator. He can rule by, he can declare an emergency whenever he wants and again have full dictatorial powers, which he's quite capable of doing.
How can a man be a dictator when he's won every single election for the last 9 years, 11 elections and referenda in total?
The first ever defeat at the polls for President Hugo Chavez. He says he accepts voters' rejection of a referendum that would have given him sweeping new powers, but he says
the electorate decides by 1% that they're not going to accept these reforms. And he says, that's fine.
Well, what would a dictator do in that situation? Well, a dictator would probably nullify the results and jail his opposition. Instead, Chavez goes on the airwaves and says, I congratulate the opposition, they have won today.
Now, is this the conduct of a dictator or of a democrat?
The coverage of the referendum is just the latest chapter in the conflict between Hugo Chavez and the Western media. The headlines just did not square with what was on the ballot. Case in point, the story that had Chavez won, he would become Venezuela's president for life. The truth is, Chavez proposed that the country's two-term limit on its head of state be lifted, allowing him to run for a third term in 2012 and possibly again after that.
In mainstream media speak, this becomes President Chavez's attempt to become, quote-unquote, president for life. Well, there's nothing that would resemble that in the language of the amendments. He would still face re-election. He would still face this recall process that he's faced once already. So it's not an attempt for Chavez to become a dictator or a dictator in waiting.
The point is this: if any politician of the opposition were to become as popular as he is, then they can be re-elected forever. And so it is still democratic, and more important than that, he was putting this to the electorate. That is to say, he was going through about that in a democratic way.
Having unlimited executive presidential terms is not controversial in Europe at all. We estimate that, we know, that there are 17 out of 27 countries in Europe that don't have term limits. So what was being proposed in Venezuela wasn't in itself controversial, but obviously it kind of plays into this whole idea of Chavez as some kind of populist demagogue.
That idea has been splashed across newsprint and the airwaves ever since the early days of the Chavez presidency, particularly in 2002, when there was an attempt to overthrow Chavez, who had been democratically elected. The Bush administration approved of the coup, and so did elements within the U.S. news media.
There's a vicious campaign against what has been taking place in Venezuela. And I think you have an indication of their attitude when you look at their reaction to the coup d'etat in 2002.
The New York Times cheered the coup, saying democracy has been saved from a would-be dictator. This is truly Orwellian, that the elected president was removed in a coup that was supported by the elites of the country, and this was a move toward democracy, not away from democracy. That's very typical, I think, of the U.S. media frame on Chavez.
This time around, the coverage of the referendum campaign was along those same lines. The New York Times called it Mr. Chavez's power grab. A Los Angeles Times editorial was headlined, "Venezuela veers toward dictatorship," while an opinion piece in the same paper described Venezuela's elected leader as public enemy #1. And it wasn't just American newspapers. Britain's leading newspaper of the left, The Guardian, headlined its piece, "Chavez loses bid to rule until 2050, as though the next 43 years of the Venezuelan presidency were determined on referendum day.
They ignored, for example, a whole series of progressive legislation, such as the 36-hour week for workers in Venezuela, which is an enormous advance. The right to set up workers' councils and popular councils of a democratic character, which would be a colossal advance in democracy. Things of this character, which are entirely progressive and which have been entirely ignored by the media.
Media watchers also noticed a pattern to the television coverage of the referendum. News channels running the Venezuelan story alongside coverage of the election in Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Good morning. There are two key elections around the globe, two major U.S. rivals.
What was interesting was that this Venezuelan referendum process was running parallel with the presidential elections in Russia. And I think there was a tendency in the Western media to try and draw parallels between these so-called authoritarian democracies. And I think there was a tendency towards oversimplifications of what was happening in Venezuela in order to try and draw out these parallels with Russia more forcefully.
The United States media found two tyrants and two dictators that they could sort of join at the hip. The processes that were going on are very different in the two countries, but you can kind of combine the two to create this narrative that the U.S. media was happy to tell.
Then there was this incident on CNN Español, where they ran images of Chavez alongside Colombia's president with a headline that said, "Who killed him?" The channel apologized for what it said was an innocent mistake. The graphic was from a previous story. But such is the distrust between the Chavez camp and channels like CNN that the president threatened to sue.
And then the latest, on November 28th, the image of the president of Venezuela and "Who killed him?" Mistakes, so many mistakes, that outlet makes many mistakes.
I think the problem with the CNN on Español was that really it just underscores the level of tension around the role of the media, how politicized the media are in the whole debate around Venezuela. And I think given that we've had, previous incitements to the assassination of Chavez from the United States with Pat Robertson, for example, I think that really this just plays into anxieties and paranoias in Venezuela.
Hugo Chavez is no angel. He is bombastic and undiplomatic.
What kind of revolution is this? A Hummer revolution? A whiskey revolution? No, this is a real revolution.
Esto es una revolución de verdad, compadre.
He has called President Bush a donkey, a devil, and worse. But that's not what the Western media were accusing him of this past week. They were saying that this politician, whose democratic credentials are in order, was a dictator in waiting. This is not the first time that the Bush administration has made untrue allegations of the leader of a petroleum-producing country, nor is it the first time that the Western media have echoed those allegations in an uncritical way. Our Global Village Voices now on President Chavez and how the media cover him.
Outside of Venezuela especially, there's been, I'd say, an orchestrated campaign of hostility towards Chavez. But if you give it a context, if you say, well, okay, he wants to give people the right to re-elect him, but on the other side, there's a new right to a recall referendum. So halfway through his term, he can be voted out of office as well as into office. They never mention that.
I think that the fact that Chavez has lost the referendum can be a good thing for him, in the sense that it may make him rethink the way he relates to the media, to the public in general, to other leaders. And I think Chavez can take from that and becoming less of a polarizing figure as well.
Reforms that were harder to spin into something negative, such as reduction of the working week to 36 hours, were downplayed or ignored by the media.
If you've got a smart take on the news media, just email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net and we'll find a way to get you on the air as one of our Global Village Voices. Time now for our Listening Post News Bites. Khartoum may have forgiven the teddy bear teacher, but some Sudanese clerics say they're convinced that the whole incident was some kind of media conspiracy. Around the time that British teacher Gillian Gibbons was pardoned and flown out of Sudan, the country's Assembly of the Ulamas issued a statement saying that the naming of the teddy bear after the Islamic prophet was no accident, that it was in fact part of a campaign of the so-called War on Terror and the intense media campaign against Islam. If that's true, that would make the classroom of 7-year-olds who voted to name the teddy bear Muhammad the youngest, most savvy media operatives on the African continent. Earlier this year, we reported on the firing of the infamous American radio host, Don Imus, who was taken off the air after making racist and sexist comments about a women's college basketball team. This past week saw the return of the shock jock. His new gig is being simulcast on Citadel Radio and RFD TV in the U.S., and will provide him with considerably less exposure than he had before. Imus's new broadcast crew includes 2 African-American colleagues. And on his first show, Imus vowed he won't repeat the kind of comments he made about the basketball players from Rutgers.
So I will never say anything in my lifetime that will make any of these young women at Rutgers regret or feel foolish that they accepted my apology and forgave me.
Despite that assurance, Imus's new employers are taking precautions. The show is being broadcast with a 21-second delay designed to prevent any more offensive Imusisms from going out on the air. The recent Republican YouTube debate on CNN got some big ratings, the highest ever for a presidential primary debate on cable TV. But the network is still getting grief over a question from the floor from a retired military man.
And I'm an openly gay man. I want to know why you think that American men and women in uniform are not professional enough to serve with gays and lesbians.
Shortly after the debate, it emerged that the questioner was involved in Hillary Clinton's campaign for the Democratic nomination, but that CNN had failed to spot that.
But certainly, had we had that information, we would have acknowledged that in using his question.
Later, CNN fought back, saying it was more interested in the relevance of the issue than the affiliations of the questioners. The revelation this past week from U.S. intelligence agencies that in their view Iran has not had a nuclear weapons program since 2003 has thrown a wrench into the networks and news organizations that have been covering this story.
From America's Newsroom, I'm Ainsley Earhart.
But Fox News, which has repeatedly called Iran a threat, is not about to stop now. The network drew some selective conclusions from the intelligence report.
It says Tehran continues to enrich uranium, which can be used to make an atomic bomb. The National Intelligence Estimate says Iran could have nukes by 2010.
Fox is sticking to its guns, but it wasn't the only news outlet wrong-footed by the intelligence report. Given the U.S. mainstream media's sorry performance in assessing the intelligence on Iraq, the Iran intel story and how the media report it will be worth watching. Well, you can add the French news agency Agence France-Presse to the list of mainstream media organizations cozying up to citizen journalism sites. AFP has bought a 30% stake in Scoop Live. Scoop Live was created last year in France and relies on citizen photos and videos. When they provide a scoop, the site sells it on to conventional news companies. AFP says it will not interfere with editorial decisions, but it has already renamed the site Citizen Side. We're back after the break with a story on American TV writers taking their battle for online compensation online.